Hello and welcome to Let's Read Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is an audio presentation of the novel, with occasional clarifying commentary from me, the reader. If you want to jump straight to the text, feel free to skip ahead to the next video in this playlist. To access the playlist itself, check out the video description below. Otherwise, stick around, and I'll explain the nature of this project a bit further, while providing some background material on the book. The basic purpose of this Let's Read is to make the literature as accessible as it can be in an audio format. Typically, when you read classical literature in print, you have a number of advantages at your disposal. An introduction from a literary scholar, notes containing background information that might be lost on a modern audience, time to absorb complications in the text, and so on. In a conventional audiobook, by contrast, you get simply the spoken text rolling on. But not here. With this project, I will read through the entirety of the book with you, but I will retain the license to add comments where I think it may be helpful to a general audience. In just a moment, I will provide some introductory background information on the novel. When completed, this Let's Read will also contain some concluding thoughts on the book, but it will also have some notes sprinkled throughout the reading, simply to clarify points that the average listener could easily miss. I will do my best to keep a light hand and to allow the text to stand on its own. But it will sometimes be useful to identify references or to sum up events, and so you will be hearing my comments every so often to flesh out the full picture of Dostoevsky's work. I will reserve my own analysis and reactions to the text for the final video of this sequence. When I do have embedded comments in the text, they will virtually always appear at the end of a chapter, in order to avoid breaking up the flow of the narrative. There will be other occasions where I will provide clarifying comments visually on the screen. For instance, every now and then a character might use an expression in French or German, or perhaps quote the words of another figure in a way that might be hard to parse in audio format. There may be other cases where an obscure reference can be identified swiftly with a visual cue. In all such cases, I will keep the text flowing, but the clarification will be available to you if you keep your eyes open. Now, currently you are viewing this project as part of a YouTube playlist, and I will start making these videos available to the public once I'm roughly a third of the way through the recording. When completed, I will likely assemble all the parts of the playlist into 3 or 4 lengthy videos. If you prefer to listen in that format, the video description below may show you how to do so. Otherwise, feel free to stick around with this playlist. If you are keeping it here, our next item of business is an introduction to the novel itself. First off, Crime and Punishment is in the public domain. This recording is based upon the Barnes & Noble Classics edition, which has been translated by Constance Garnett, with light edits throughout by Julia Salkovskaya and Nicholas Rice. This edition also contains an introduction by Priscilla Meyer of Wesleyan University. In this format, it is 521 pages long. It has a total of 41 chapters, composing 6 parts and an epilogue. Crime and Punishment is one of the world's most celebrated crime novels, and it is often hailed as one of the most vivid and insightful fictional portrayals of the psychology of the criminal. It was published serially in 1866, toward the beginning of the mature period of Dostoevsky's career, and it was the first of 4 full-length novels that virtually all critics now recognize as great works. But to understand its greatness, it is helpful to know about the man who wrote it, and it is critical to understand how the text interfaces with the ideas of its time. The author broke onto the scene as a young man exactly 20 years earlier, with his debut novella Poor Folk. During his formative years, he had been influenced by the Russian literary pioneer Alexander Pushkin and the German romantic Friedrich Schiller. And in the mid to late 1840s, he began his career by enlarging upon themes from Nikolai Gogol in works like Poor Folk and The Double. For a brief period, he was recognized as a protege of Vissarion Belinsky, the leading Russian radical of his generation. Dostoevsky's own political perspective at that time might be called a kind of Christian socialism, influenced in part by the French utopian socialists like Charles Fourier, and motivated principally by his loathing of the institution of serfdom. Dostoevsky's involvement with the left-wing Petrashevsky circle led to his arrest on political charges in 1849, and famously to a death sentence that was commuted at the last minute by the Tsar to prison in Siberia. While the dramatic change of sentence was choreographed, Dostoevsky's harrowing moments awaiting his own execution in Semenovsky Square would remain with him for the rest of his life, as would his 4 years in the Siberian prison camp, which are described in his memoirs, The House of the Dead. Both experiences give an apocalyptic flavor to the best works of his mature years, as the writings of a man who had experienced life at its uttermost margins. The echoes of each can be heard in Crime and Punishment, sometimes explicitly, as the narrator describes states of mind that are like what the condemned will think or feel as he heads to his execution. The French critic André Gide, upon reading this novel for the first time, ingenuously asked, "This Dostoevsky, has he killed somebody?" He hadn't, but for 4 years he lived cheek by jowl with those who had. The Petersburg to which Dostoevsky returned in 1859 was a different place from the one he left, and the cultural shift only increased as the 1860s ripened. In a nutshell, the radicals had become more radical, more insolent, and more numerous. This change is associated with the rise of a group of intellectuals known as the Raznochinцы, a new social group developing in a rapidly shifting Russian populace. The abolition of serfdom in 1861, among other preceding factors, shook up the established order, and from the resulting cracks emerged young, educated persons from various walks of life who did not have an obvious home in the traditional Russian system, and indeed, in part inspired by Western ideas, thought the traditional Russian system itself needed to be replaced altogether. A striking portrait of the new generation came in 1862 with the publication of Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. The hero of that novel is a young man named Bazarov, who styles himself a nihilist and who calmly and brazenly declares to his landowning elders that all the values and traditions of the older generation are worthless. The likes of a Pushkin, once a hero to a youthful Dostoevsky, had no real value at all, since he did nothing to put food on the table or meet any of mankind's material needs. Bazarov is a complicated character, and by Turgenev's own admission, the best reader of his work was Dostoevsky himself, who recognized the nuances of what Turgenev was doing with his protagonist. For everyone else, Fathers and Sons was a political Rorschach test. Some conservatives thought Bazarov was being deified and were scandalized. Some liberals thought the same and were delighted. Other conservatives thought he was being accurately vilified and were delighted. Some radicals thought he was an unfair caricature of their perspective and were offended. Among the latter was Nikolai Chernyshevsky, one of the leading radicals of the 1860s. His novel, What Is to Be Done, was a rejoinder to Fathers and Sons, and portrays heroes who are animated by a principle of rational egoism. The idea that human beings are motivated solely by self-interest, but if they were enlightened as to what is truly to their advantage and were to act accordingly, society as a whole would prosper. The principle of charity, by this reckoning, is a mistake which is out of keeping with what is best for the individual and for society. Science on this score is the only arbiter of truth and the only guide to sound social policy. But among the radicals who were delighted with the character of Bazarov was one Dmitry Pisarev, who thought of a character like Bazarov as standing majestically above the common herd. This is what he wrote in his journal, The Russian Word. Quote, "The masses, in every period, have lived contentedly, and with their inherent placidity have been satisfied with what was at hand. This mass does not make discoveries or commit crimes. Other people think and suffer, search and find, struggle and err on its behalf. Other people eternally alien to it, eternally regarding it with contempt, and at the same time eternally working to increase the amenities of its life." Unquote. A character like Bazarov, the article argues, is not constrained by the common conventions of society and has every right to violate them, even for the purpose of benefiting those who live under their sway. The Dostoevsky of the 1860s was himself progressively minded, but the ideas of a Chernyshevsky or a Pisarev struck him as being grotesque distortions, which failed to grasp human nature as it really is. In 1864, he wrote a literary broadside at the ideas of Chernyshevsky in a novella entitled Notes from Underground. In 1866, with Crime and Punishment, his most direct target is Pisarev and the notion of a special kind of person who can exist above the common masses. But rather more is going on in Crime and Punishment than a response to figures like these. The novel is often referred to as a kind of murder mystery, where the mystery is not who the culprit is, but why the crime was committed in the first place. The true motives of our killer are hidden, it seems, even to the killer himself, and the novel takes its time unraveling the deepest sources of his volition. More broadly, this is a story of the effect of wrongdoing on the mind, and of how the criminal can hope to orient himself toward his fellow man, or alternatively how he might succumb to despair of doing so altogether. Understood in this way, the drama continues all the way to the final page of the epilogue, as the nature, scope, and authority of the moral world are on trial throughout the work. The protagonist is a young man named Raskolnikov, and arguably he has supplanted Bazarov as the most famous fictional portrayal of an 1860s raznochinets. Educated, intelligent, and proud, he has fallen into poverty and is wrestling with new and dangerous ideas. His soul is a kind of battleground between warring ideas and values, as his very name suggests. There is a multi-layered meaning to the name Raskolnikov. On the one hand, the Raskolniki were a religious sect often referred to as Old Believers, who objected to various 17th century religious reforms of the Russian Orthodox Church. This sect does make a brief appearance in the novel and has a kind of indirect relation to Raskolnikov's psyche. But the Raskolniki were so called because they dissented and split off from the main group. Raskolnik can be translated as dissenter, or alternatively as schismatic. And so Raskolnikov's mind is dangerously split between different impulses, even as he is split off from the society around him, in part because of his own dissent against it. Naturally, as a fully developed Russian novel, we can expect several subplots throughout the narrative, including the financial travails of the protagonist's mother and sister, the plight of a hopelessly impoverished Petersburg family, a love quadrangle featuring a beautiful young woman, the troubles of a noble prostitute, the machinations of an arrogant and calculating bureaucrat, the villainies of a debauched aristocrat, and, of course, an ongoing duel between a criminal and the legal authorities that threaten him. At the epicenter of these events is our protagonist, and the characters who surround him often reflect aspects of his own psyche, which take on definite form in comparison and contrast to the people with whom he interacts. As this is largely a story about psychological self-discovery, the question of narrative position originally posed a problem for Dostoevsky. His first instinct was to write in first person, as though our criminal were leaving notes in his journal. This style of narrative had been frequently used by Dostoevsky, and it allows access to the mind of a character which would be able visibly to shift its attitudes and perceptions over time. The trouble, though, is that it would be simply unthinkable for the protagonist to be in a state of mind that would allow him to sit down and write any notes, let alone reliable ones, given some of the events that take place in the plot. Other maneuvers with the first-person device, such as the notes being written weeks or years after the fact, weren't consistent with the curious murder mystery he was attempting to weave, nor was a perfectly omniscient third-person narrator, which would give too much of the game away. The narrative problem was tortuous enough for Dostoevsky that he wound up burning a first draft in 1865. In the end, he settled on a special kind of third-person narrator. This narrator is not confined to the consciousness of Raskolnikov, and we will sometimes get a peek at what is happening in other parts of Petersburg. However, the narrative voice is tightly connected to what is happening in the mind of Raskolnikov, sometimes even seeming to engage in a kind of dialogical relation with that mind, or, when the scene shifts, with the mind of other characters. This method was not entirely unprecedented, and Dostoevsky had already tried something like it earlier with The Double, but it was daring for its time. Similarly, the narrative handles time in a creative way. We begin in the midst of things, and only after considerable development do we get a sense of what has gone on in the prior 6 weeks of Raskolnikov's life. The plot proper covers roughly 2 weeks, but does not do so evenly. Some days breeze by as if in a dream, while others take up 100 pages or more. Time appears to slow down or speed up, just as it might be felt to do by the person traveling through it. The final text of the novel is a fusion of 2 creative ideas that Dostoevsky had been playing with for some time. One was expected to be a novella about a Raznochinets criminal. The other was to be a novel called The Drunkards, which would feature a family torn apart by alcoholism. That novel was never written, but furnished much of the material of Crime and Punishment. Not all of the plot elements of the novel are entirely Dostoevsky's own invention. Some of the structure of the novel is borrowed from Balzac's novel Père Goriot, which has a cast of characters similar to several of the characters populating Crime and Punishment, and who are facing similar personal conflicts. But Dostoevsky takes this content, adds to it, changes it, and in the end makes it entirely his own by enriching the naturalistic source material with a deep and resonant spirituality. In fact, it is impossible to have a full appreciation of Crime and Punishment without at least some understanding of the New Testament Gospels, which haunt its pages from beginning to end. Finally, some words should be said about Russian naming conventions before we preview a cast of characters. Russian names have three parts: a first name and a surname, but in between the two a patronymic, which contains the first name of the individual's father, followed by an ich or an ovna, depending on the sex. Sometimes a character will be referred to by his last name, sometimes by the first name and patronymic, and sometimes by the first name alone, or by a diminutive of the first name. So, one of our characters is Sofia Semyonovna Marmeladova. From that second component, we can infer that her father's first name is Semyon. More fully, it is Semyon Zaharovich Marmeladov. In a formal mode of address, we might refer to the daughter as Sofia Semyonovna, but in fact she is rarely addressed in that way. Much more frequently, she is called by the diminutive Sonia. And indeed, there are a lot of names. So I have included a dramatis personae for your reference. It is not exhaustive, but it contains the main players and many of the minor ones. Our main character is Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, sometimes called Rodia by loved ones. His mother is Pulcheria Alexandrovna. His sister is Avdotia Romanovna, although she is often referred to by the diminutive Dunya. Raskolnikov has a landlady named Praskovya Pavlovna Zarnitsyn, who in turn employs a servant named Nastasia. He also has a friend named Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumikin, usually referred to by last name. Razumikin in turn uses the service of a young doctor named Zosimov, whose first name we never learn. These characters all have interests that are mostly aligned, as they are generally concerned for Raskolnikov's welfare. A separate group with its own troubles is the Marmeladov family. The alcoholic father of the family is Semyon Zaharovich, and he is married to Katerina Ivanovna. His daughter by a prior marriage is Sofia Semyonovna, who is more frequently referred to as Sonia. She plays a significant role in the novel. Katerina Ivanovna has 3 younger children by her prior marriage, named Polenka, Kolya, and Lida. The family stays in a part of an apartment managed by their landlady, named Amalia Fyodorovna Lipeveshel, although Katerina Ivanovna often ridicules her landlady's German heritage by calling her Amalia Ludvigovna. The scene of the crime of our novel features the target, an old pawnbroker woman named Alyona Ivanovna, although she is usually referred to just as the old woman. She has a very gentle younger half-sister by the same father named Lizaveta. 2 characters named Kok and Pestryakov discover the crime. A painter in the same building named Nikolai becomes a suspect. Then there is the local law enforcement. The lead investigator is a very clever middle-aged man named Porfiry Petrovich. The police precinct features an ambitious young clerk identified as Zametov, and it is led by a superintendent named Nikodim Fomich and a fiery assistant superintendent called Ilya Petrovich. Finally, we have figures who are associated with the past adventures of the female Raskolnikovs and the people aligned with them. One of them is a wealthy gentleman named Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, in whose home Dunya was once a governess. His wife is Marfa Petrovna. Another is the man who hopes to marry Dunya, named Peter Petrovich Luzhin. He has a younger associate with whom he is a roommate, whose name is Andrei Semyonovich Lebezyatnikov. A minor figure who never enters the stage is a merchant from the provinces named Vakrushin, from whom Pulcheria Alexandrovna sometimes borrows money. All these figures and more populate one of the most famous novels of the 19th century. It is high time we get to that novel. So, without further ado, Crime and Punishment.